So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. Thank you to Dominique for all your organizational efforts. So my name is Kupensky, and I'm from Bowdoin College. And this particular project is a set piece from my larger work, which is to analyze artistic representations of the Ebro Hydroelectric Station. And so this is a sort of isolated piece that deals with one particular day and a specific group of individuals who, with a high degree of likelihood, witnessed evidence of the Holodomor. This particular day is the opening of the Ebro Hydroelectric Station on the 10th of October, 1932. And I'd like to start my remarks with the same anecdote that I started my paper, which is that last fall I was invited to speak at the Zaporizhia Book Fair because there were many Americans and many members of the Foreign Press Corps who came to the Ebro Hydroelectric Station over the course of its construction. There were a number of travel narratives written about the site and the city, many of which are only available in English, and none of which were in the city of Zaporizhia. And so I wanted to bring a number of these texts to donate to the local history museum. But when I was going through customs, these texts were, they searched my bags, and they found these books about the 5-year plan written in English, and there emerged this slightly absurd moment where I'm trying to convince the border guard that this isn't communist propaganda, but in fact is evidence of the Holodomor. And this is the particular image that we settled upon. There was a larger interaction here. But there was this particular moment. We were looking at this photograph from James Abbey's I Photograph Russia that was published in 1934. And I was trying to explain to the border guard that in Abbey's text, which is written in English, he describes a moment where he steps away from the opening of the Ebro Hydroelectric Station to photograph bread lines, to try to photograph images of starving peasants in the countryside, and also to photograph corpses. And in the discussion of this image, as I'm trying to convince the border guard that this isn't an image celebrating the Soviet Union, but is trying to undermine its mythologies, he was utterly unconvinced. And there was something about the existence of the bread line that was not sufficiently convincing to draw his attention away from the power and the majesty of this big building project. And this particular interaction made me go back to one of the questions that haunted my research about the construction and the representation of this dam, which is why were so many why were so many Western journalists, Anglophone journalists who attended the opening ceremony incapable of seeing the visual evidence of the famine while reporting on the event. And so I want to say a couple words about how the opening ceremony was conducted, first of all. And to try and stay under 10 minutes, we'll skip a few slides. So the opening ceremony took place on the 10th of October, 1932, and it had all the elements of a mass spectacle. Because it was the launch of arguably the biggest building project in in the European part of the Soviet Union, there were a number of American and foreign journalists who showed up, including James Abbey from the New York Times, Margaret Burke-White from Fortune magazine, Louis Fisher from The Nation, Malcolm Muggeridge from the Manchester Guardian, Eugene Lyons from United Press International, and Anna Louise Strong from Moscow Daily News. And when many of these journalists arrived at the opening ceremony, in their contemporaneous newspaper articles, and memoirs and autobiographies and travel narratives, almost all of them describe being utterly overwhelmed by the visual power of the completed dam, something which would have been completely inconceivable when the project started in 1927. James Abbey himself said that when I saw the Dnieperstroy Dam, I thought socialism was all built and felt like rushing to the telegraph office and shooting Stalin a wire, congratulating him on having successfully industrialized the Soviet Union. But as the years went by, many journalists began to note that they had seen evidence, that they had seen starving peasants while traveling to the ceremony in the areas around the opening and then on their way going home. One of them, and in many of the oral histories that are currently being done in Zaporizhia, many of the individuals who are still alive, who ended up in Zaporizhia, narrate these stories of coming to the Dnieper Hydroelectric Station to escape the famine. One of them is Petro Horishny, who settled in the village of Pavlokichkas, which is less than a kilometer away from the dam, where his parents dug an earthen hut and went to look for work. Then only 7 years old, he scavenged for food by digging up gophers, grabbing eggs, picking the corn grain from the troughs of horses harnessed in the dam stables. But not everyone who had come to Zaporizhia was nearly as fortunate. And the teacher living in Kharkiv Oblast, Alexander Radchenko, described how when reading about the completed dam at Dnieperstroy, sometimes I'm overcome with such an uncontrollable hatred that I'm sick. What's the use of these tempos for the children and people swollen from hunger? And so many of the accounts of the opening of the Dnieper Hydroelectric Station are juxtaposed with the famine, implying a direct material connection between the resources that were sent to the urban areas and evacuated from the countryside. So the main thing that I'm interested in my article, in this particular set piece, is looking at the way that the American journalists and Western journalists who were present during the opening ceremony, what type of language they used to try and make sense for themselves and to try and project to a reading public the reasons why they didn't report on the famine in real time. And one of the only individuals who did report on the famine in roughly real time was James Abbey, the photographer from the New York Times. He does so in this photograph that held me up on the border, which marginalizes the industrial object and tries to put some sort of visual evidence of the famine in dialogue with it. Other times when he went out into the countryside, his handlers prohibited him from taking photographs of other evidence. And so at the end of his texting, he includes this quote he calls them the photographs that I did not take, which reads as follows. The main street of this little Ukrainian village, some 8 miles from the gorgeous Dnieperstroy Dam, a crumpled figure lying on the curb resting in eternity. He was just too hungry. And so in the absence of this image, we have to be skeptical of these type of things. But what Abbey drew his attention, what Abbey does in this particular quote is far more than other journalists did. And so what my paper focuses on is 4 particular metaphors that come up again and again and again. The first metaphor being blindness. Malcolm Muggeridge, in his autobiography, he deploys this particular image of blindness, where he describes traveling to the opening ceremony, being at a train station, I'm relatively certain that this is in Kharkiv. And he writes that at this train station, he noticed a large German correspondent carelessly threw out the window a leg of chicken he had been gnawing at. And there was a concerted move to pick it up. The gesture and the response have stayed with me through the intervening years like stigmata. It seems somehow symbolic of our whole situation that we were should be coursing so closely through this vast country that was our territory, seeing and yet not seeing. Another metaphor that comes up a lot is this metaphor of hypnosis. For example, the Hungarian writer Arthur Koestler, who was living in Kharkiv in 1932, he remembered that the train stations were overrun by starving peasants. But he described how the foreigners visiting these industrial colossi traveled in a state of hypnosis. So hypnosis is one of the metaphors that comes up. Another one is addict, is that these foreign correspondents were addicted to these industrial colossi. Another one is that they fetishized these industrial objects. Taken collectively, the point that I would like to make is that taken collectively, these images reveal that there was something about the aesthetic power of industrialization that monopolized the attention of the foreigners who were on the site, and distracted them, and it seemed to make them, in their own accounts, incapable of seeing the tragedies that lay in the wake of industrialization. Very lastly, I would like to look at one example from the city of Zaporizhia today, which is the monument to the Holodomor, which attempts to undo this narrative of privileging industrialization over memorializing the victims of collectivization. The monument to the victims of the Holodomor is placed in a way so that the white cross echoes the power lines coming out of the hydroelectric station. And I think this is done so beautifully because after coming to the monument, it fundamentally transforms the hydroelectric station itself into a monument to the victims of the Holodomor. The power lines running for thousands of miles throughout southern Ukraine functionally becoming monuments to the victims of the dead. Thanks.